Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we winter sow Liatris seeds. So let's go. Starting perennials from seed is absolutely the cheapest way to have perennials in your garden. If you're new to my channel, welcome. And if you're new to the whole winter sowing process, I highly recommend you watch this whole video because I go over a lot of important information related to winter sowing. However, if you've seen a lot of my other videos or you're very comfortable with the winter sowing process, feel free to jump to the timestamp shown below. Winter sowing is the process of sowing seeds outdoors during the winter months. You can simply scatter the seeds out on the ground, or you can sow the seeds in some sort of a container or pot. When it comes to what kind of container or pot to use, there are so many different choices out there. The big thing is you want to make sure it's translucent or clear. I like to use milk jugs, but I know other people have used juice jugs, rotisserie chicken containers, totes. The possibilities are endless. The big thing is, no matter what container you choose, you want to make sure that it can hold at least 4 inches of soil in it. Your containers should have holes in the top to allow water or moisture to come in. The containers should also have holes in the bottom to allow for proper drainage of water. I like to use potting mix. You can use whatever works for you. The key is to make sure that it's well draining and also that it retains some moisture. You don't want to use a seed starting mix because it's too light, too fluffy, and it will dry out way too quickly. You also don't want to use garden soil because it's very heavy and it's too compacted, which makes it difficult for roots to grow in. There are a ton of benefits when it comes to winter sowing. It's very easy to do, it's cheap. It doesn't require any additional equipment. You don't need any grow lights. You don't need any room inside your house. Another benefit to the winter sowing process is that the seeds will get a natural cold stratification period. That's very important for certain seeds such as perennial seeds. And in the end, your seedlings will be stronger, they'll be healthier, and they'll already be hardened off. You don't need to do the whole hardening off process like you would have to do if you started your plants indoors. Now, there is a certain timeline that you want to follow when it comes to winter sowing. If you start your seeds too early, there is a chance that those seeds will germinate prematurely. And if you get a cold snap, some of those plants that germinate quickly can die. However, if you start your seeds too late, what will happen is certain seeds, like the ones I talked about earlier that need a certain period of cold stratification time, they might not get that full period of cold stratification that those seeds need. So timing is everything. Now, of course, when it comes to the timing, it's going to vary from location to location. A general guideline is you do your winter sowing sometime starting in the month of December, but you want to be done with it sometime about 2 to 3 weeks before your average last frost date. But I want to give you a more specific timeline that I'm going to be following and that you can follow as well. So about 5 to 6 months before your average last frost date, you want to be sowing seeds that are requiring a cold stratification period. And those are usually perennials that are hardy in your area where you live. About 3 to 4 months before your average last frost date, that's a great time to be starting cold hardy plants. Plants that can tolerate cold, but also plants that reseed very easily in your area. Approximately 1 to 2 months before your average last frost date is a good time to start plants that are not cold hardy, plants that do better in warmer temperatures. Now, keep in mind though that when those seeds germinate, if you are going to have a cold snap, if you're going to have some cold nights, cold days, you want to protect those seedlings. You may need to cover them during that time. You may need to bring in your containers just for a few nights during those cold snaps. Don't be discouraged if you're running out of containers for winter sowing. Even though there are a lot of containers you can use, I prefer to use milk jugs. In fact, one year when I didn't have that many milk jugs, I contacted a local Starbucks. I asked them if they could hold some milk jugs for me. Well, they go through so many milk jugs a day, they were more than happy to hold a few bags for me. So definitely reach out to local coffee shops if you're looking for some sort of containers that are translucent or clear. Some people like to pre-moisten their potting mix, and that is totally fine to do. The reason you won't see me doing it in my winter sowing videos is because it is frozen outside during the months of January and February. So I'm just giving a small amount of water, but then I'm placing the milk jugs outside where they're going to be frozen for a long time. And as soon as the weather warms up, I'll start watering the milk jugs more often. In order to keep your milk jugs from flying around, you can always corral them together and then put some sort of a barrier around them just to keep them together. There are a lot of different options out there. You can use some sort of temporary fencing, you can use some sort of bricks or stones. You can be creative, but just be sure that your milk jugs are not toppling over and blowing around in the wind. I'll start with a quick plant profile, and after that I'll show you my process for winter sowing the Liatris seeds. Liatris is also known as blazing star or Gayfeather. It's a long blooming perennial wildflower, and it has a highly unusual flower head featuring tiny and colorful star-like blossoms arranged around a long upright bottle brush spire. Here's a fun fact for you. Liatris, which comes in either white or purple blossoms, blooms from the top down. And that's quite different than most perennials out there, which typically bloom from the bottom up. Blazing Star is hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9, and if you already have this in your yard, then you'll know that the plant very happily reseeds itself. You might find little tiny grass-like blades at the base of your plant. Those are just little seedlings that are sprouting. But if you don't have this plant in your yard and you don't have the seeds, your next best option is to be able to buy this plant bare root. You'll often find it sold in big box stores in the early spring months. Personally, I think that's a lot cheaper than actually going to a nursery and buying the plant already established in a pot. But the absolute cheapest way is to start it from seed. So if you know of someone that has this plant in their yard, let the plant go to seed and ask them if you can collect seeds from their yard. I'm sure they wouldn't mind. The plant is hardy in many parts of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. What I'll do is put a list down below of all the places within the US as well as Canada where you'll find Liatris is hardy. As some of you know, I have a backyard plant nursery on my property where I live, and this is where I sell a whole bunch of plants. I've been told by a few people that Liatris is considered native in New Hampshire. I did a little bit more research on it. It appears that the New England blazing star is the plant that's actually hardy to New Hampshire as well as other areas within New England. And from what I understand based on my research, it's considered to be a rare plant. So if you do have that plant, consider yourself lucky. You'll find that this plant blooms from mid to late summer, and it really thrives in a full sun situation. There are dwarf varieties which are shorter and grow only to 3 feet in height. And then there are some taller varieties that you'll find that can grow all the way up to 9 feet in height. The plant thrives in a well-draining soil. It does not like to be too wet. So if you plant this in a very wet area with very clay soil, what's going to happen is you're most likely going to cause the plant to have its roots rot, and then the plant will probably die. It's considered to be not a very heavy feeder. So if you actually have this planted in a fertile area with pretty good soil, you actually don't need to add any additional fertilizer. But if your soil is not good at all and there are some issues with it lacking a lot of good nutrients, in those cases, you do want to apply fertilizer to your Liatris plant. Liatris attracts many pollinators, including the bees, the butterflies, and even the hummingbirds. And the plant is considered to be deer and rabbit resistant. However, just know that the younger, smaller plants that are not established yet may get nibbled by the rabbits, so you may have to protect younger seedlings. The seeds need light to germinate, so when you sow your seeds, you're just basically pressing the seeds into the soil surface. If you are going to cover the seeds, only cover it with about 1/8 of an inch of potting mix, seed starting mix, or vermiculite. And no matter how you start your seeds, just know that Liatris seeds need a period of cold. This is called cold stratification. And Liatris seeds specifically need between 4 to 6 weeks of a chill period. Now, I'll be achieving that by placing the seeds in my milk jug and putting the milk jug out in the cold during these winter months. However, if you want to start the seeds indoors under grow lights, or if you're sowing these seeds during a period of time where there's no cold weather outside, then what you want to do is place the seeds in your refrigerator and basically mimic that cold period for 4 to 6 weeks. After that, you can sow your seeds either outside in milk jugs, out in your landscape, or inside under grow lights. And if you are going to sow the seeds indoors, be sure to sow them about 6 to 8 weeks before your expected average last frost date. If you don't know what your last frost date is, I'll provide a link below. Go to that website, enter in your zip code. It'll tell you what your average last frost date is, but there's also a map on there that gives you a better indicator of that date. And if you live outside of the United States or you don't have an actual zip code to enter, Just go ahead on the internet, do a search on your location to find out what your average last frost date is. The seeds, be it inside or outside, will germinate once they are ready, and that's typically when the soil is about 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're growing your seeds in a very cold room that doesn't reach those temperatures, then you'll need to add a seedling heat mat in order to raise the temperature of your soil. When you grow Liatris from seed, don't expect it to bloom the first year. It most likely will not. In fact, it might not even bloom the second year. Be patient. It is well worth it, though, growing this plant from seed. Next, I'm going to show you what I do to winter sow Liatris seeds. You can see that these are seeds that have been collected. This one here is a dwarf variety of Liatris, and it's a purple color. And then this one over here is a white colored Liatris. Even though I'll be sowing both of these seeds this winter, together we're going to sow this packet right here. There are so many different containers you can use for winter sowing, but regardless, no matter what container you're using, always make sure it's a clean container. And you want to be sure, no matter what container you're using, it can hold about 4 inches of potting soil. You can see that that goes right around here. So when I make my cut, I want to make sure I'm cutting around here, but I also need this part here. I don't want to cut into it because this will be the handle to open and close my mini greenhouse. I'm going to need something sharp to cut my mini greenhouse or my milk jug. So I'm going to be using these. You can use scissors or anything else that you have. These are just cutting shears or snips that you would use to cut tin. I threw away the cap because I want to leave this part open. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure that you have some sort of holes in the top of it to allow for water like rain or snow to come in here, and that will help keep everything nice and moist inside of your mini greenhouse. And if for whatever reason you're not getting any moisture and things are drying out, you can always add water into this hole as well. I do like to add additional holes in the top here, but that's completely optional. I've been doing it for years and that's worked for me. You also want to add drainage holes in the bottom of your container. That will allow water to come out if there's too much water in here. And it also allows it so if you want to bottom water your container, you can easily do that because then the water can wick up and it can water the soil and the seedlings that are in here. I always like to add more than less holes in the bottom because I want to make sure that this container has good drainage. And that's all I'm going to add for holes. It's a small container. If this was a much larger container, then maybe I'd add some additional holes in the center here. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut my container. Some people like to use a marker and make a line. I'm not going to worry about that. It doesn't need to be a perfect line. I'm just going to start somewhere around here and I'm going to make my way onto the other side. Now I'm going to stop because I don't want to cut all the way through. I want to have an area here and here. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that I'm using the handle as a hinge for my mini greenhouse. And notice they don't perfectly line up, and that is totally okay. Next, I'm going to go ahead and get some potting mix filled into the bottom of this container. I like to use potting mix, not seed starting mix. I find that it's better for holding the water and also it doesn't dry out as quickly. And I'm actually using potting mix that I made myself, and I'll put a link down in the description below on how to make your own potting mix. It saves a lot of money in the long run. The next thing is to push down lightly, not very hard. I'm trying to eliminate any sort of air pockets that might be in here. But I also don't want to press down too hard because as the plants start growing and their roots are forming, you want to make sure that the roots can grow inside of this potting mix. And that's what the Liatris seeds look like. I will be heavily sowing the seeds. You don't have to sow this many seeds if you don't want to in your container. I have a plant nursery, plus I like to have plants in my landscape, so I want plenty of seedlings. So I'm going to best that I can just scatter the seeds on the surface here. And it's okay if some overlap because again, once the seedlings start emerging, what I'll be doing is pricking them out. What I often say is there's really no right or wrong on how many seeds you want to sow in your container. Some people just like to do 3 or 4, and some people like to heavily sow them just like I do. It really comes down to how much work it is for you. for me, this might be a lot of work because there are so many plants in here. I just need to be much better this year about going through as soon as seedlings start emerging and taking care of them and getting them out of these containers and getting them either potted up or planted out in my landscape. The next thing I'm going to do is press down on the seeds. I want to make sure that the seeds are making good contact with the soil. And again, I'm not going to be covering these because the seeds need light to germinate. And if you did want to cover them, just cover them very, very lightly with something like vermiculite or potting mix. And when you think about it, this is like Mother Nature. We have plants that drop their seeds. The seeds are right out there for Mother Nature to do her thing. No one's out there interfering. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're just doing it in a more controlled way, which is my preferred method. I don't just like to scatter them in the yard because I want to be able to control where I put these plants. I like to use garden markers whenever I label anything in terms of my winter sowing because I find that the marker doesn't wear off as easily. And you can see I created a label. It says dwarf purple and then Liatris. And I like to label the inside of my container in case for whatever reason the label on the outside gets worn off or comes off. I'm just using this small hand water pump sprayer. You can use whatever you want to water your potting mix as well as your seeds. And I'm giving it just a gentle spray. I don't want to give it a very heavy spray because I don't want to dislodge any of the seeds. And remember, you may need to moisten all of your potting mix. Where I live, as soon as I bring this outside, this is going to freeze and it's going to stay frozen for days. And there will be some snow and rain that may come inside of here. But the main thing is it will be frozen. So I won't really need to add any more additional water to this, probably for the next month and a half to 2 months. I'm just using a paper towel to wipe the sides because I find it's easier to stick the duct tape onto the container if it's dry. I'm just using duct tape to seal my container shut. I know some people like to punch holes in the top as well as the bottom of their container, and then they like to close it using some sort of a twisty tie or pipe cleaner, and that seems to work well. So use whatever you want to close your container as long as you're able to easily open it on the days when it gets really hot outside because you don't want to burn your seedlings. But then on the days that it's kind of cold and you need to protect them, you need to be able to close this. Since we're sowing perennial seeds, I'm not too worried about it getting too cold in here. And the reason is these are hardy perennials in my zone. So since I typically winter sow perennials first, December, January, and February, I only add a few pieces of the tape on my container. There's really no use in me adding tape all the way around the container because even if some cold comes in here, it's not going to kill off these perennial plants once they start germinating. They'll be fine. And they're not going to germinate anyway until the soil conditions are right, and it's usually much later into the spring season. Now, when I start winter sowing plants that are not hardy, say vegetables or annuals that are not hardy in my area, then I may need to add tape all the way around. But I'm not going to worry about it now for my perennials. I've never done this before. I've only added 2 pieces or 3 pieces of tape, and I've always had success. I'm pushing down. I want to make sure that the tape is sticking to my container. I'm going to use my garden marker again, and I'm just going to label what the plant is in here. I used to label it directly on the container itself, but I actually like to reuse my containers. They usually last 2 to 3 seasons. So instead, I now label it on my tape. Some people, instead of putting in the plant name on the tape, they like to number it. So they might put a number 1, and then number 1 on a piece of paper or a spreadsheet would be the plant name. So Rebecca. Number 2 might be lupin. Number 3, foxglove, and so on. So I'm just going to write down Liatris, and then that it's a dwarf purple. I like to write it on both sides because when I'm looking at all the containers, it just makes it easier in terms of when I'm lifting it. I don't need to spin it around, but this is totally optional. You don't have to do the label on both sides. And the next thing is I'm going to place the milk jug with all my other containers that I have outside. I want to make sure I place this in a full sun location. I want rain and snow to come in here. And this is also getting placed in an area where it's not going to fall over in the wind. It's going to be in a very protected area. I'll be sure to give you updates once the Liatris seedlings start germinating, and then what my process is for pricking those seedlings out of the milk jug and then either potting them up or putting them in my landscape. Let me know in the comments if you have Liatris growing in your yard, and if so, do you have the purple one, the white one, or both of them? Also, have you ever tried growing Liatris from seed? This is my first year, so I'd love to know if you've ever tried that. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.